Good morning. This week, we are getting into contemporary Latin American history. And we'll start off with the onset of the Cold War. Now, one thing that's important to note is with the onset of the Cold War, you had economic theories and policies, primarily ISI or import substitution and industrialization in Latin America. And so you had economic development strategy that was aimed at reducing foreign dependency through local production of industrialized products. It focused on domestic manufacturing of previously imported goods to satisfy domestic demand, protecting domestic industries through high tariffs, import quotas, and government subsidies. Its intention was to create employment, reduce foreign exchange demand, and promote self sufficiency. Often criticized for creating inefficient industries, lacking economies of scale, and leading to high costs for consumers. Now, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, promoted structuralist economics, emphasizing state intervention and ISI. The founder, Raul Prebisch, an Argentine economist, served as an executive director and advocated for structuralist policies. He argued that the global economic system perpetuated the underdevelopment of per, per, peripheral countries through deteriorating terms of trade. Dependency theory, another economic theory, emerged also, which asserted that the global capitalist system maintained the underdevelopment and dependency of peripheral countries on core countries. The proponents of this theory called for de-linking from the global capitalist system and pursuing self-reliant development strategies. In regards to labor and trade unions formed to represent worker interests and negotiate with employers for better wages, working conditions, and benefits. The General Confederation of Labor, the CGT, emerged as a major labor federation in several Latin American countries, uniting various trade unions under a single umbrella organization. Strikes became a common tactic employed by labor unions to pressure employers and government officials to meet their demands, often leading to work stoppages and economic disruption. Collective bargaining allowed unions to negotiate contracts with employers on behalf of their members, establishing agreed upon terms for wages, hours, and working conditions. The labor movements played a significant role in advocating for worker rights and improving working conditions in Latin America during this period. Governments and employers often resisted the demands of labor unions, leading to tensions and conflicts between workers and those in power. Some labor movements faced challenges such as political repression, internal division, and the influence of competing ideologies socialism, communism, anarchism. Despite the challenges, labor movements contributed to the development of labor laws, social reforms, and the expansion of worker rights in many Latin American countries. Some of these reforms, particularly, were connected to labor laws and worker rights. The governments introduced labor laws to regulate working conditions, hours, and employment practices in response to the demands of labor movements and changing social attitudes. Social security systems were established to provide workers with benefits such as retirement pensions, disability insurance, and health care coverage. Minimum wage laws set a legal floor for wages to ensure that workers received a basic level of compensation for their labor. Worker rights expanded to include protections against discrimination, unsafe working conditions, and arbitrary dismissal. Now, these reforms improve the lives of many workers and their families by providing a social safety net and improving working conditions. The expansion of Social Security and labor laws contributed to the development of welfare states in some Latin American countries. These reforms helped to reduce income inequality and promote greater social mobility, although the extent and effectiveness of these measures varied by country. The implementation of these reforms were often gradual and faced resistance from some sectors of society, particularly business interests and conservative political forces. Latin America, during the Cold War, experienced rapid urbanization during this period as people migrated from rural areas to cities in search of employment and better living conditions. The growth of cities led to the emergence of new social classes, including an urban working class and a growing middle class. Urbanization also brought challenges, such as overcrowding, inadequate housing, and the growth of informal settlements. For example, favelas in Brazil, villa miserias in Argentina. Governments and urban planners struggled to keep pace with the rapid growth of cities, leading to problems with infrastructure, public services, and social tensions. Other areas of reform were the expansion of education, particularly at the primary secondary levels, which created new opportunities for social mobility and the emergence of a more educated workforce. The growth of a middle class fueled by urbanization, industrialization, and the expansion of white collar jobs, government bureaucracy, professions, altered traditional class structures. Social mobility remained limited for many, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds or marginalized groups, indigenous populations, Afro descendants. Despite some progress, social inequalities persisted, and the benefits of economic growth and social reforms were not evenly distributed throughout society. So, what we ended up seeing is revolutionary movements due to inequality. These movements swept through Latin America during the Cold War era. From Nicaragua to Peru, guerrilla groups fought against oppressive regimes and U.S. influence, aiming to establish socialist states through armed struggle and popular mobilization. These movements employed various strategies, including guerrilla warfare, focal theory, and liberation theology. The impact on Latin American politics and society was profound, shaping the region's history and leaving a lasting legacy of social activism and political change. So, first we have the Sandinista National Liberation Front in Nicaragua, the FSLN. They were a Marxist Leninist revolutionary group founded in 1961 to oppose the Somoza family dictatorship, named after Augusto Cesar Sandino, a Nicaraguan revolutionary who fought against the U.S. occupation in the 1930s. They engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Somoza regime throughout the 60s and 70s. They gained widespread support from the Nicaraguan population due to the Somoza regime's corruption and human rights abuses. They overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979 and established a revolutionary government led by Daniel Ortega. Then we have the Faramundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador, the FMLN. Also, Marxist Leninist guerrilla coalition formed in 1980 during the Salvadoran Civil War, named after Farabundo Martí, a Salvadoran communist leader who led an uprising against the government in 1932. It consisted of five leftist guerrilla groups that united to fight against the US backed Salvadoran government. They engaged in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and political organizing to challenge the government's authority. They signed a peace agreement with the government in 1992, ending the 12-year civil war and transitioning the FMLN into a political party. Then in Peru, we have the Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla organization founded in 1970 by Abimal Guzman, a former philosophy professor. He sought to overthrow the Peruvian government and establish a communist state through a peasant led revolution. He engaged in a violent campaign of guerrilla warfare, terrorism, and assassination throughout the 80s and early 90s. targeted government officials, security forces, and civilians, causing widespread fear and instability. They were largely defeated by the Peruvian government in the mid 90s, but remnants of the group continued to operate in remote areas. Then you have the Tupamaros in Uruguay, a left wing urban guerrilla group active in Uruguay during the 60s and early 70s. Named after Tupac Amaru II, an 18th century Peruvian indigenous leader who led a rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. They engaged in armed robberies, kidnappings, and political assassinations to challenge the Uruguayan government. They sought to create a socialist revolution and redistribute wealth in Uruguay. They were largely suppressed by the Uruguayan military in the early 70s, with many members imprisoned or exiled. And then lastly, we have the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, also Marxist Leninist guerrilla organization founded in 1964 as the armed wing of the Colombian Communist Party. They engaged in a long running conflict with the Colombian government lasting over 5 decades. They controlled significant territory in rural areas of Colombia, using drug trafficking and kidnapping to fund its operation. They sought to overthrow the Colombian government and establish a socialist state. They signed a peace agreement with the Colombian government in 2016, ending the conflict and transitioning the FARC into a political party. Now, the revolutionary strategies were threefold. One was guerrilla warfare, which was a military strategy employed by small, mobile groups of irregular fighters against large conventional forces. Relied on tactics such as ambushes, sabotage, hit and run attacks, and the use of terrain to cover and concealment. It aims to gradually weaken the enemy through attrition, psychological warfare, and the disruption of supply lines. Often used by revolutionary movements in Latin America due to the asymmetry of power between guerrilla groups and government forces. Examples including the tactics used by the FARC and the FMLN in El Salvador. Then you have focal theory, a revolutionary strategy developed by Ernesto Che Guevara based on his experiences in the Cuban Revolution. Proposes that a small group of dedicated revolutionaries, the focal, can spark a widespread revolution through their example and actions. It emphasizes the importance of rural guerrilla warfare, with focal serving as a catalyst for the mobilization of the peasantry. Argues that the right conditions for revolution can be created through the actions of the focal rather than waiting for them to develop on their own. It influenced many revolutionary movements in Latin America, such as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the ELN in Colombia. And then lastly, we have liberation theology, a theological movement that emerged in Latin America in the 50s and 60s, combining Christian teachings with elements of Marxist socialist analysis. It emphasizes the need for the church to actively work for social justice and the liberation of the poor and oppressed. It interprets the teachings of Jesus Christ as a challenge, as a call to challenge oppressive structures and fight for the rights of the marginalized. Played a significant role in shaping the ideology and actions of some revolutionary movements, such as the FMLN in El Salvador. Key figures include Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, Leonardo Boff in Brazil, Oscar Romero in El Salvador, the last who was assassinated for his advocacy of social justice and criticism of the um, Salvadorian government. Then we turn to national security, state, and the dirty wars. The Cold War era saw Latin America become a battleground of ideologies. As the US and the Soviet Union vied for global influence, many countries in the region fell under military rule. These regions, backed by the US, used anti communist rhetoric to justify their power grab. Military dictatorships in countries like Chile and Argentina crushed opposition with brutal force. They worked through Operation Condor, sharing intelligence and carrying out cross-border assassinations. This dark period saw widespread human rights abuses and the suppression of democracy across Latin America. Now, the Cold War involved a global struggle between the capitalist US and the Communist Soviet Union that shaped political, economic, and social developments around the world, including Latin America. Two superpowers engaged in a proxy wars, espionage, and an arms race, creating a tense international atmosphere and influencing foreign policy decisions of many countries. Latin American nations were pressured to align with either the US or the Soviet Union, leading to political polarization and ideological conflicts within these societies. Now, the national security doctrine emphasized the need for strong military control and the suppression of perceived threats to national stability, particularly communist or leftist movements. This doctrine was adopted by many Latin American governments, often with the support or encouragement of the US, as a means to maintain order and prevent the spread of communism. Anti communism became a central tenet of government policies, leading to the persecution, imprisonment, and even execution of individuals and groups suspected of having communist sympathies or affiliations. The fear of communist influence was used to justify repressive measures, human rights abuses, and the concentration of power in the hands of military leaders. For example, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, Jorge Rafael Vidala in Argentina. One way this occurred was coups d'etats, which refers to the sudden, often violent overthrow of a government by a small group, typically members of the military or political elite. In Latin America, numerous military coups occurred during the Cold War, often with the backing or tacit approval of the United States, which viewed these actions as a means to prevent the spread of communism. These coups led to the installation of military dictatorships that ruled with an iron fist, suppressing political opposition and civil liberties. For example, the Brazilian military government from 1964 to 1985. So some of the prominent leaders were Augusto Pinochet, an army general who led a military coup in Chile in 1973, overthrowing the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende. Pinochet's regime was characterized by severe human rights abuses, including torture, forced disappearance, and the execution of political opponents. Jorge Rafael Vidala, a senior commander in the Argentine army, played a key role in the 1976 Argentine coup d'etat that established a military junta. Under his leadership, the Argentine military government engaged in a dirty war against suspected leftists, resulting in the disappearance and death of thousands of civilians. The government that took hold was authoritarianism, referring to a form of government characterized by strong central power, limited political freedoms, and the suppression of opposition. The military dictatorships that emerged in Latin America during this period were highly authoritarian, restricting civil liberties, censoring the media, and using violence and intimidation to maintain control. These regimes often targeted intellectuals, activists, and anyone perceived as a threat to their power, leading to widespread human rights abuses and creating a climate of fear and repression. One way that this panned out was through Operation Condor, a secret intelligence and operations program established in the 70s by several South American military dictatorships, including Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The program aimed to coordinate the sharing of intelligence, the tracking of political opponents across borders, and the carrying out of assassinations and disappearance. Operation Condor allowed these repressive regimes to collaborate in their efforts to eliminate perceived threats and maintain their grip on power, resulting in the death and disappearance of thousands of individuals across the region. Military dictatorships in Latin America during the 60s and 80s were marked by widespread human rights violations. In Argentina's dirty war, thousands were kidnapped, tortured, and killed by the military junta. The regime used systematic violence to suppress dissent and spread fear. Grassroots activism, like the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, demanded the justice for the disappeared. In official investigations such as CONADEP and the Nunca Mas report documented atrocities and laid groundwork for future trials aiming to prevent such abuses from happening again. Desaparecidos were referred to the victims of forced disappearance during Argentina's dirty war, where the military junta abducted, tortured, and even killed thousands of political dissidents and activists. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 30,000 people were disappeared during this period. Many of the desaparecidos were young activists, students, trade unionists, and left wing militants. The disappearances were carried out by the military, police, and the right wing death squads with the aim of suppressing opposition to the regime. For example, they used ESEMA, Escuela de la Mecánica de la Armada, which was a notorious detention center in Buenos Aires, where many of the desaparecidos were held, tortured, and killed. It operated as a clandestine torture and extermination center in the Dirty War. Prisoners were subjected to brutal interrogations, electric shocks, waterboarding, and other forms of torture. Many of the detainees of ESEMA were drugged and thrown alive from planes into the Atlantic Ocean in what became known as death flights. Torture was widely used by the military junta as a means of extracting information, punishing dissidents, and spreading fear among the population. These included electric shocks, beatings, rape, and prolonged periods of solitary confinement. Torture was often carried out in secret detention centers and military bases across the country. Death squads, often operating with the support or acquiescence of the military, carried out extrajudicial killings and disappearances of suspected subversives. These squads targeted left wing activists, journalists, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as a threat to the regime. The death squads operated with impunity and were rarely held accountable for their crimes. Now, the Dirty War in Argentina refers to a period of state terrorism in Argentina from 76 to 83, characterized by widespread human rights abuses, disappearances, and repression. The military junta that seized power in 76 launched a campaign of terror against perceived opponents, justifying their actions as necessary to combat left wing subversion. It resulted in the death of thousands of Argentinians and the forced exile of many others. Operation Colombo was a disinformation campaign carried out by the Chilean secret police, the DINA, in collaboration with the Argentine military to cover up the disappearance and murder of Chilean and Argentine dissidents. So there was an international collaboration and cover up of the dirty war atrocities. In 1975, the bodies of 119 Chilean and Argentine dissidents were discovered in Argentina, many of whom had been abducted and killed by the Chilean and Argentine security forces. To deflect attention from their crimes, the DINA planted false stories in the media claiming that the victims had died in internal conflicts within left wing guerrilla groups. Operation Colombo highlighted the close collaboration between the military regimes of Chile and Argentina in their efforts to suppress political opposition and conceal human rights abuses. As a response to the human rights violations, you had grassroots activism and demand for justice. One case was the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, a group of Argentine women whose children were disappeared during the Dirty War. The mothers began gathering in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires in 1977 to demand information about the fate of their missing children. They wore white headscarves and carried photos of the disappeared loved ones. The mothers courageously defied the military regime and brought international attention to human rights abuses in Argentina. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo continued to advocate for justice and accountability for the crimes of the Dirty War. Then you have CONAPE, Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas, was a national commission established by President Raúl Alfonsín in 1983 to investigate the disappearance and human rights violations that occurred during the Dirty War. This organization collected testimonies from survivors, families of the disappeared, and witnesses to the abuses. The Commission's work played a crucial role in documenting the systematic nature of the repression and laying the groundwork for future trials of military officials. Nunca Más was a report called Never Again, released by this organization, CONAPTEP, in 1984. It was a comprehensive account of the human rights abuses committed during the Dirty War. It detailed the systematic use of torture, disappearance, and extrajudicial killing by the military regime. It also included harrowing testimonies from survivors and relatives that disappeared, as well as evidence gathered from secret detention centers and military archives. The report's title, Never Again, expresses the hope that by exposing the truth about the Dirty War, Argentina could ensure that such atrocities would never be repeated. The Nunca Más report became a symbol of the struggle for truth, justice, and memory in Argentina, and inspired similar truth-telling efforts in other countries emerging from periods of repression and violence. Besides grassroots, you also had social and religious opposition. Liberation theology, which I mentioned earlier, emerged as a religious movement within the Catholic Church in Latin America during the 50s and 60s. It emphasized the importance of social justice and the liberation of the poor and oppressed, drawing on Marxist ideas and the concept of preferential option for the poor. The priests and religious figures were influenced by religious liberation theology, often worked with marginalized communities, and supported their struggles against oppression and equality. Some notable proponents of liberation theology were the Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who were targeted and killed by right-wing death squads for their activism and criticism of the government of El Salvador. You also had university students who played a significant role in organizing protests and resistance against military dictatorships in Latin America. Student movements often embraced left-wing ideologies and demanded greater democracy, social justice, and the anti-state repression. In Mexico, the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre was when government forces killed hundreds of protesting students, galvanized opposition to the ruling PRI party. Student protests in Brazil, such as the 1968 March of the 100,000, challenged the military dictatorship and called for restoration of civil liberties and democratic rule. Labor unions and workers were important in the resistance against military dictatorships. Unions often organized strikes, work stoppages, and demonstrations to protest against the erosion of worker rights, declining living standards, and state repression. In Chile, the Central Union of Workers, a CUT, played a key role in opposing the military dictatorship of Pinochet and advocating for the restoration of democracy. In Brazil, metal work unions in the ABC regions of Sao Paulo, led by figures like Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, organized major strikes in the late 70s and early 80s, challenging the military regime and laying the groundwork for the rise of the Workers' Parties, or PT. Human rights organizations, lastly, emerged in Latin America to document and denounce the abuses committed by military dictatorships, including torture, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearances. Groups like Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, the Vicariate of Solidarity in Chile worked tirelessly to uncover the truth about the fate of the disappeared and to seek justice for the victims of state terror. Human rights organizations often collaborated with international bodies such as the UN and Amnesty International to raise awareness of human rights violations and to pressure governments to respect human rights. The efforts of the human rights organizations helped to galvanize opposition to military dictatorships and contributed to the eventual transition to democracy in many Latin American countries. International pressure also played a significant role in the resistance against military dictatorships and the eventual transition to democracy in Latin America. In the US, under President Carter, 77 to 81, he made human rights a key component of its foreign policy and pressured Latin American dictatorships to respect human rights and hold democratic elections. The Catholic Church, particularly under Pope John Paul II, also spoke out against human rights abuses and supported the struggle for democracy in Latin America. International human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch documented abuses and lobbied governments to take action against repressive regimes. The resistance against military dictatorships, combined with international pressure and changing geopolitical circumstances, eventually led to a wave of democratization in Latin America during the 80s and 90s. In Argentina, the military junta's defeat in the Falkland Malvinas Wars in 82 and the growing opposition movement forced the regime to call for election, resulting in the restoration of civilian rule in 83. In Chile in 1988, a referendum took place in which the opposition campaigned for no vote against the continuation of Pinochet's rule, and it paved the way for a transition to democracy and the election of civilian president in 1989. The end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s also contributed to the decline of military dictatorships in Latin America as the perceived threat of communist subversion diminished and the United States shifted its foreign policy priorities. The last thing that we're going to look at is the debt and the lost decade in Latin America. Debt crisis and structural adjustment programs. Now, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s rocked the region's economies. Countries struggled to repay massive foreign loans, leading to economic hardship and declining living standards. The crisis sparked international intervention and set the stage for major economic reforms. In response, the IMF and the World Bank introduced structural adjustment programs, SAPs. These programs required countries to implement austerity measures, privatize state owned enterprises, and liberalize trade policies while aimed at promoting growth. SAPs often exacerbated poverty and inequality in the short term. Latin America's debt crisis began in the early 80s when many countries in the region struggled to repay massive foreign loans. The causes of the crisis include excessive borrowing during the 70s, rising interest rates, and falling commodity prices. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina were among the most heavily indebted nations. The debt crisis led to severe economic hardship, high inflation rates, and declining living standards for many Latin American citizens. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank played a central role in managing this crisis. They provided emergency loans to indebted countries, but attached strict conditions such as SAPs. This required, of course, austerity measures, reducing government spending, privatized state owned enterprises, and liberalized state policies. The critics argued that SAPs often exacerbated poverty and inequality while prioritizing debt repayment over social welfare. This came out of 1989's U.S. Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady introducing the Brady Plan as a strategy for resolving the debt crisis. The plan was aimed to reduce countries' debt burdens by allowing them to exchange existing loans for new bonds with longer maturities and lower interest rates. Participating countries were required to implement economic reforms and structural adjustments as part of the deal. The Brady Plan helped to alleviate some of the immediate pressure on the indebted nations but did not address the underlying structural issues that contributed to the crisis. SAPs were often present as necessary conditions for receiving loans and financial assistance from international institutions. Austerity measures were central to SAPs, requiring governments to drastically cut public spending. This included reducing funding for social programs, education, healthcare, infrastructure projects. Austerity measures disproportionately affected the poor and vulnerable segments of society, leading to increased poverty, inequality, and social unrest. Critics argued that austerity measures undermined long term economic growth by suppressing demand and limiting public investment. SAPS promoted the privatization of state owned enterprises, arguing that private ownership would lead to increased efficiency and predictability. Governments were encouraged to sell off public assets such as utilities, transportation systems, and natural resources to private investors, often foreign countries. Deregulation involved removing government controls and restrictions on various economic activities, such as labor markets, environmental protections, and financial transactions. Market liberalization aimed to open up economies to foreign trade and investment, reducing tariffs and other barriers to international competition. While these policies were intended to stimulate economic growth, they often led to job losses, reduced wages, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Many Latin American countries adopted neoliberal policies in the 80s and 90s, often as a condition for receiving loans from the international financial institutions. Chile under Pinochet was one of the earliest and most comprehensive adopters of neoliberal policies in the region from the 70s to the 80s. Mexico embraced neoliberal reforms in the 80s under President Miguel de la Madrid, including privatizing state companies, lowering trade barriers, and attracting foreign investment. Argentine President Menem, 89 to 99, implemented an extensive neoliberal program, pegging the peso to the dollar and privatizing state assets. Then you also had trade liberalization, which involved the removal or reduction of restrictions or barriers on the free exchange of goods and services between nations. Latin American countries significantly reduced tariffs and eliminated non tariff barriers to trade in the 80s and 90s. This led to the creation of NAFTA in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was a major milestone in regional trade liberalization. Then in 91, you had the establishment of Mercosur in South America, which promoted free trade and the fluid movement of goods, people, and currencies among its members Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. Then you also had FDI, or foreign direct investment, which occurred when a company from one country makes a physical investment in another country, such as opening factories or purchasing companies. Many Latin American countries reformed their laws and regulations in the 80s and 90s to create a more favorable environment for FDI. Mexico received significant FDI inflows after joining NAFTA, particularly in the manufacturing sector for maquiladoras. Brazil attracted substantial FDI in the 90s, especially after the creation of the Real Plan in 94, which brought inflation under control and stabilized the economy. Furthermore, you had domestic economic reforms, fiscal discipline, leading which refers to measures taken by the governments to reduce debt deficits and accumulation of debt. Latin American countries, often as part of IMF-backed stabilization programs, implemented austerity measures to cut government spending and increase revenue. These measures included reducing subsidies, freezing public sector wages, and increasing taxes or improving tax collection. Brazil's Plano Real in 94 successfully brought hyperinflation under control through a combination of fiscal discipline, currency, and high interest rates. You also had privatization, the sale of state owned enterprises or assets to private investors. Many Latin American countries had a large number of state owned enterprises in sectors such as utilities, telecommunications, and natural resources. Privatization was seen as a way to reduce government budget deficits, attract foreign investment, and improve the efficiency of in Argentina under President Menem. It embarked on an extensive privatization program in the 90s, selling off state-owned companies into telecommunications, airlines, and oil. Mexico's program in the 80s and 90s included the sale of banks, steel mills, and the state-owned telephone company Telemex. Now, the consequences of neoliberal policies were the following. You had the gap between the rich and the poor widen, with wealth concentrated among elites. Poverty rates stayed high despite economic growth, and many turned to informal work to survive. Labor markets became more flexible, leading to job insecurity and weaker unions. Urbanization increased as people moved to the cities for work. Social movements emerged to resist these changes, with grassroots groups fighting for rights and equality. Also, these policies led to increased inequality in Latin America, with the rich getting richer while the poor struggled to make ends meet. Poor rates remained high in many countries despite economic growth, as the benefits were not evenly distributed among the populations, particularly in Brazil and Mexico. The informal economy expanded as many people turned to unregulated and untaxed economic activities to survive, such as street vending or domestic work. The lack of a social safety net left vulnerable populations without access to health care, education, or unemployment benefit, exacerbating poverty and inequality. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite, often with close ties to political power, led to a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Privatization of state owned enterprises benefited well connected individuals and foreign investors while workers faced layoffs and reduced benefits. Land concentration increased as large agribusinesses and multinational corporations acquired vast tracts of land, displacing small farmers and indigenous communities, example in Guatemala and Brazil. Limited access to credit and financial services for the poor and small businesses perpetuated economic disparities and hindered social mobility. In regards to labor, it promoted labor market flexibility, which often translated into reduced job security, lower wages, and weakened unions. Temporary contracts, outsourcing, and subcontracting became more common, leaving workers vulnerable to layoffs and exploitation. For example, maquiladoras in Mexico. The informalization of labor increased as many workers turned to unregulated and unprotected jobs in the informal sector, lacking benefits and stability. The decline of traditional industries such as manufacturing led to job losses and the need for workers to adapt to new economic realities. Rapid urbanization occurred as people moved from rural areas to cities in search of employment opportunities, often leading to the growth of informal settlements, favelas in Brazil. Internal migration from poorer regions to more prosperous areas within countries increased, putting pressure on urban infrastructure and services. International migration, particularly to the United States, became a survival strategy for many families, with remittances becoming a significant source of income. Mexico, Central America. Brain drain of skilled professionals seeking better opportunities abroad impacted the development of Latin American countries. So, as a result of this inequality, you had social activism, particularly grassroots movements and resistance. Social movements emerged in response to the negative impacts of neoliberal policies, demanding greater social justice, economic equality, and political participation. Labor unions, student organizations, and community groups mobilized to protest privatization, austerity measures, and the erosion of social rights. For example, the Zapatista movement in Mexico. Women's movements advocated for gender equality, reproductive rights, and an end to violence against women, challenging traditional gender roles and patriarchal structures. Environmental activists opposed the exploitation of natural resources by multinational corporations and fought for the protection of ecosystems and indigenous lands, for example, the Cochabamba water war in Bolivia. You also have struggle for indigenous rights. Indigenous rights movement gained momentum as communities resisted the encroachment of their lands by extractive industries and agribusinesses. Demands for cultural recognition, autonomy, and the right to self determination became central to indigenous struggles. The Machupe in Chile and the Quechua in Peru. Indigenous organizations challenged the neoliberal development model, advocating for alternative visions of progress based on traditional knowledge and practices. International alliances and solidarity networks formed to support indigenous struggles and raise awareness of their plight. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, for example, was passed. So that's all I have for today. Anyways, I hope you all have a good day. Any questions, you know where to reach me. Talk to you all next week. Bye bye.